I promised to...
Being recorded this morning.
Oh, sorry about that.
Zoom meeting.
I promised to keep the introductions short, so I will. It's a great pleasure to welcome Douglas Reid Skinner to the Red Wheelbarrow tonight, and welcome to all of you. Writing poetry is usually a solitary activity, as we know, but Douglas has brought company because he's brought friends and collaborators, because he's also a translator, as you know, as you saw from the blurb. And Douglas is a man who's done lots of things in his life. He's worked in many different fields, and he's very good at seeing the connections between those fields. I recently heard him talk about the connection between building, which is an industry that he's been involved in, and the writing of poetry, that the poetry is also making a building, and that is a very fine thing to remember. And he's a very fine craftsman of poems, maker. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome Douglas and company. Can we have a round of applause for them? Yeah. I'm not going to mute. We will have a short question and answer session after the reading, and then a short break and an open mic section. So, Douglas, welcome. Over to you.
Good evening. Thank you to everyone for joining in. And thank you to the Red Wheelbarrow for convening these evenings, especially tonight's sound engineers, Jacques and Nondwe. I thought a change of diet might be entertaining and have chosen to foreground a few translations. To this end, I've asked some friends to join me in reading from some of the work I've engaged in over the years, either on my own or as joint enterprises. For the habit of translating, I ought to acknowledge 4 friends. In particular, Israel Ben Yosef and Doug Livingston, who are sadly both passed on, Marco Fazzini in Vicenza, Italy, who is with us in the room tonight, and Johan de Lange, with whom I work on the Avbob Poetry Project. Why is translating important to me personally? Quite simply, I think it has given me a deeper understanding of writing, and it keeps me learning. Whether or not that makes one a better writer is not for me to judge. Why is translation important in general? We need to keep in touch with what is going on in poetry and other cultures. It adds to our stores of knowledge, understanding, vision, and technique. So I've divided the evening into 2 parts. Firstly, a segue and some translations. And then the second part is a set of echoes, by which I mean some of my own work roughly related to one or more of the translations. I hope not to eat into the evening's usual second session of open mic poems, but in case that happens, let me tender my apologies in advance. If anyone would like to get hold of any of the books I mentioned tonight, let me know by email, and I'll advise it accordingly. I heard a wonderful line yesterday on television in a science program: the faint pressure of sunlight. Now, you can actually run a spaceship. You can move a spaceship in outer space just with the action of the sun's energy flowing outwards, the faint pressure of sunlight. Okay, first up is a segue. Merriam-Webster's definition will serve: to make a transition without interruption from one activity, topic, scene, or part to another. So I think you all know who Jonty Driver is. In 2017, late 17, Jonty sent me an interesting poem called Manifesto in 28 lines for stanzas. I was so impressed that I just had to write a reply. in the Elizabethan fashion, this kind of echoing and responding and segueing was quite common in Elizabethan times. And so I wrote a response called Some Sort of Riposte, which because I've tinkered with the poem, has become just riposte. Unusually for me, the poem came out in an afternoon. I've asked Jonty to read his poem, Manifesto in 28 lines, and then I'll follow with mine. So Jonty, over to you, unmute.
I think I am unmuted. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, yes.
The epigraph is from Ezra Pound, somewhere in the cantos. He wrote, "To break the pentameter, that was the first heave." But not for me. For me, the I am's thud is like my pulse. It beats and beats and beats, as if my wrist were gripped to hear the heart. And after 2 or 3 repeats, I need to take a breath, to pause, to hesitate, to help myself to think what I say next. A poem's not words alone, but rhythms too, and sometimes rhymes, and all the sounds between. The syntax equally, the way it links this thought to that idea, this object loosely latched to sensual metaphor, connecting thus until it seems to be a quiet conversation with myself, which, when I choose, I let some readers share. Of course, they may not want to interrupt. This isn't just in fun, nor yet a game for grown-ups who pretend they make their worlds by speaking them aloud. It's serious stuff. A repetition in the finite mind of that first word assumed to make us all. Imagination yoking heart and head, and finding sense in all that complicates what may turn out to be our simple lives, from birth to death and never back again. And that is where I want to place my poems, the center of myself, the paradigm of all I hope that I might learn to be, the nearest I shall get to paradise.
Okay, so my poem is called Riposte, to C.J. Driver's poem, Manifesto, in 28 lines. And the poem is on iambics. And my counter argument in the epigraph stakes is attributed originally, it's been attributed to a number of people, but as far as my research shows, it was Juan Ramón Jiménez, the Spanish poet, who first uttered it. And I won't butcher the Spanish, but I'll give you the English. If they give you lined paper, write in another direction. So this is riposte. And I cheated a little by using a few French words to get the right syllabic balance and the right emphases. And hopefully you'll pick up, I'll get the French right and you'll pick up on the French. Riposte. Well, there is cause indeed for us to spend an afternoon at least with lots of wine. It must be read, you will agree, and just a little cheese to put upon a dry biscuit and keep one's estomach at ease while talk and thought go circling round and round what's lost or gained by sticking to iambic feet, iambic feet, iambic feet. I cannot say if it is fair to use a bit of French to keep the metronome en point. I have no doubt you'll have your say. I know the boy employed to drum and keep the band of many marching feet in time cannot afford to trip or skip a beat, and yet, us variable as the weather humans, need a soupçon more leeway wherein to range without too much impediment. Not quite verse libre, an oxymoron fashioned by the ill-advised who couldn't have known the future would cast it as the grand excuse, but that which can accommodate the spread of natural ups and downs, the way we speak. I'm for the occasional change of beat, slight shifts of gear, or here and there, with room for dactyls, weighted pauses, and amphibraths, or occasional spondies chucked in just for fun, to string things out before the end must come. That symbolic terminus of lines and self, as like a book, you're shut and returned to the shelf. Okay, next up is my good friend from Italy, all the way from Vicenza, Marco Fazzin, who I've known since 1919, and who teaches at the University of Venice, Ca' Foscari, in the field of post-colonial literatures. Marco has been a prodigious translator from English into Italian, including selections from writers such as Philip Larkin, Geoffrey Hill, Douglas Livingstone, Seamus Heaney, and Norman McCaig. His most recent books are At the Back of My Ear, a selection of essays on contemporary English language poetry, which appeared in 2019. And I have to say, Marco's an unusual Italian writer, since he often publishes what he has to say in English before he publishes it in Italian. In 2020, his Selected Poems was published, which I did the translation, and this includes all of his books of poetry up to that point in time. And this was published in Rome, and I think that's more or less his latest book. There was, a few years earlier, a book of interviews that he did called The Saying of It, and that includes interviews with Edwin Morgan, Derek Walcott, Wally Soyinka, Douglas Livingstone, Seamus Heaney, Margaret Atwood, myself, and John Burnside, amongst others. So, aside of being an academic at Venice University, Marco is also the creator and convener of the Vicenza Poetry Festival, which ran for many years until Senor COVID sauntered into town and caused mayhem. So Marco and I will read Alla Luna and To the Moon, which originally appeared in stanzas and appears in his selected poems. Marco? Dottore?
Thank you. Grazie, grazie, Professore. Thank you very much for your introduction. This is a very difficult poem, actually, so it was particularly challenging for Douglas. It's a villanelle, so he managed some way, you know, in his own way to translate the rhymes and the rhythm. Alla luna. Luna che t'alzi, luna che torni. Dammi il tuo volto, un giovane volto, benché tu sia morta e conto i miei giorni. Amica di sempre, di mille soggiorni, cambiami il volto, questa vita che ho colto, benché tu sia morta e conto i miei giorni. Ho a lungo vagato, sognato ritorni, ma i misteri di sempre mai ho risolto. Luna che t'alzi, luna che torni. Lo so che c'è poco ormai da propormi, mi perdo nel tempo che è lento e m'è tolto, benché tu sia morta e conto i miei giorni. Odo frusciare e un richiamo di corni, mi illumini spero nel bosco che è folto, luna che t'alzi, luna che torni. È un finto sognare, non voglio più espormi, ma sono felice quando qui io t'ascolto, luna che t'alzi, luna che torni, benché tu sia morta e conto i miei giorni.
Grazie Marco. one thing I'll just mention is that it's fairly easy to pick up in the poem. There is a hint or a reference to the opening of Dante's Divine Comedy. To the moon. Moon that rises with returning ways, give me your face, the young sort, though you are gone and I count my days. Always, my friend, of 1,000 stays, change my face, this life I've sought, though you are gone and I count my days. I've drifted so long, returned in dreams always, but for me the mysteries remain uncaught, moon that rises with returning ways. There's little, I know, to offer me these days. I get lost in time that's slow and unbought, though you are gone and I count my days. I hear rustling and the calling of horns plays. Enlighten me in this dense wood where I'm caught, moon that rises with returning ways. I don't want to be exposed to a false dream's rays, but when I'm listening here, I remain unfraught, moon that rises with returning ways, though you are gone and I count my days.
Bravo.
I think everyone knows Winnie Thompson, who's a regular attendee in the Zoom meetings. Winnie taught French and English in high schools in Johannesburg and Cape Town and at UCT. Now in retirement, she teaches French conversation to adults. And as she said, she's waiting for the weather to warm up, for she'll be swimming through the summer. Winnie and I have been doing a few French translations to keep ourselves entertained. And I embarked on a project of translating one French poet in 2015, 2016, and then fairly swiftly realized that I actually needed an associate. And it took some time, but eventually I discovered that Winnie was the perfect foil, shall I say. The French poet is Jean Follin, who was born in 1903 in the Normandy village of Canisy, where he grew up. Sadly, his life was cut short in 1971 when he was killed in a car accident in Paris. Follin refers back to his idyllic childhood and the region of his upbringing, Normandy, in many of his poems, evoking La France profonde, or deep France, though never in the first person. In all of his poems, he assembles sequences of concrete images to build subtle, sometimes, in fact, often oblique or glancing narratives without any philosophical, emotional, or psychological add-on. Presenting the world as it is, without embellishment or intention, is one of the hardest things to do in poetry. And that's Follin's game. So tonight, Winnie and I will read one of those poems. Follin's poem is called L'œuf, and the translation is called The Egg. And it's from his 6th collection, Territoire, which means territories or domain. Winnie, are you there?
She is.
And if Winifred can turn her sound on. And
Okay, can you hear me now?
Ah, there she is. Excellent.
Okay. Alors, bonsoir tout le monde. L'œuf. La vieille dame essuie un œuf avec son tablier d'usage. Œuf, couleur ivoire et lourd, que nul ne lui revendique. Puis, elle regarde l'automne par la petite lucarne, et c'est comme un tableau fin aux dimensions d'une image. Rien n'y est hors de saison. Et l'œuf fragile que dans sa paume elle tient reste le seul objet neuf.
So if everyone was listening closely, they would have worked out that the first and last lines are rhymed, which I originally didn't spot, and then hurriedly yesterday suddenly realized that I hadn't been paying enough attention and had to just do a quick little revision to get that right and make sure that the English had a first and last line rhyme. The egg. The old woman wipes clean a heavy ivory-colored egg that no one else wants on her well-worn apron before gazing at autumn through the small dormer window, and it's like a fine painting, the size of a picture frame. Nothing in it is out of season, and the fragile egg she's holding in her palm is the only new thing that's seen. So that gives you a very strong idea of Fulan's method of how he assembles a simple set of concrete images. He describes something or a sequence of some things in quite a curtailed and almost minimalist way, but they end up, when they're together, all those images being so evocative and so, they lead in so many directions. Okay, so I don't know if Richard is in the house. Has he managed to sign on, or is he stuck behind no electricity?
He has not managed to sign on.
Oh, that's sad. What I was going to do was a sequence with Richard from the Catullus book. What I'll do instead is and Richard was going to read the Latin, for which he's eminently qualified and for which I'm not eminently qualified. So what I'll do is I'll introduce Richard and then I'll simply read the Catullus translation. So Richard and I launched a selection of lyric poems translated from Catullus. We launched that last year. Richard took degrees in classics, Greek and Latin, at the universities of Wits, Oxford, and St. Andrews. He has published extensively on Roman love poetry, oral poetry, and the influence of the classics on 20th century literature, and has translated books from ancient Greek, Latin, and French. His locally flavored translations of Homer's Iliad in 2012 and the Odyssey in 2017 are prescribed texts at several South African universities. He's Emeritus Professor of Classics at the University of Cape Town and a contributing editor of Stanzas. So sadly, he's been kiboshed by the intermittent electricity. So we chose to read 76, which is very much one of the Lesbia poems, and very much about his doomed love affair with this woman, but about so much more. And I think 76 captures many of the angles of Catullus's poems. What we see very strongly in a poem like this is just how contemporary he still is. Over 2,000 years ago, he wrote, and yet here's a man whose thoughts and feelings are still contemporary to this day. So this is 76. If a man could derive any pleasure from remembering past favors, knowing he's done the right thing, violated no sacred trust, entered no pact to deceive his fellow men against the will of the gods, then, Catullus, expect great joy long into the future from this one-sided love affair of yours. Because whatever good anyone might say or do to others has already been said and done by you, all badly invested in a heart devoid of gratitude. So why persist in torturing yourself? Why not make up your mind? Pull back from there. The gods are against it. and stop living in misery. It's hard to suddenly let go of a long-term love affair. Yes, it's hard, but you've got to do it by any means. It's the only way. You must win through. It must be achieved, whether possible or not. Oh, gods, if you can feel pity, if you've ever rescued anyone in this extremis, even right at death's door, look down on miserable me. And if I've led a pure life, root out this disastrous infection that like a paralysis creeps deeply throughout my body and drives all sense of pleasure from my heart. I no longer ask that she should love me in return, or, an impossibility, that she should try to be faithful. I just long to be healthy and shot of this foul disease. Oh, gods, reward me thus for doing the right thing. So sadly, Richard wasn't with us, and I think Lynthia is not with us either.
Yes.
Nandra, did Lynthia make it in?
No, she didn't.
No. Oh gosh, that's so sad. I was poodling about online one day, a few years back, and I sort of had a look at LitNet. And in LitNet, I found a couple of poems by Lynthia. And one of them really shook me. I thought, crikey, this is somebody who writes very strong poems, writes very open poems, and right from the heart. I mean, just extraordinary. So I asked around, I asked Johan if he had Lynthia's email address, and I emailed her and I said, would she mind if I translate them? Which I did, and she was very kind and generous. And since then, we've become firm friends. So Lynthia comes from Kimberley. She is one of Anthea and Franklin's 3 talented offspring. She is in part, through her mother's side, of Nama descent, whence Namaqualand gets its name. And one of the first, when Lynthia and I eventually spoke on the phone, one of the first things she said, "Jy kom ook van Namaqualand af," because I was born in Uppington. So I said, yes, I do. So she said, then we are family, which was very endearing. Her sister Siska writes very good prose, and her brother Carl is an accomplished musician. So they're a very talented family. She graduated BA Honours Cum Laude in philosophy from the University of Free State, and is studying for an MA in creative writing while also teaching. While also teaching. In 2017, she won the AVBOB. She won first prize in the Afrikaans section of the inaugural AVBOB poetry competition, and her debut collection, Uit die Kroes, appeared in 2020 to much acclaim. So again, I'm not going to. I could read the Afrikaans, but I really wanted Lynthia to read it because it needs her voice. There's a lot of vernacular in her writing, and it's wonderfully interesting sort of things that she's taught me about that vernacular. So for instance, if you come from Kimberley, you're known as a Yster, which is a Y, S-T-E-R. You're said to be from the Y, and if you're from the Y, you're a Yster. The other lovely thing is, she said, if somebody is your very good friend, then they're known as your 99. So, and so on. I mean, and her poems are filled with this lovely, interesting vernacular. She writes very directly and has a great sense of tragedy in her work. The poem I'm going to read is a translation of Net nog een. Just another one. They covered him over with a sand sheet yesterday. That boy, Kevin, from Annie, who lives in the blue. RDP house behind the soccer field. The one who exchanged his life for a 28's tattoo, who carried a gun in his backpack. before he gave up school in Standard 7. He had 5 bullets in his chest and 1 in the head. His mother asked them not to open the coffin in the church. The bullets came from a 26's gun. There was a screaming mother who ran out through her sitting room door, who was grateful the bullets hadn't hit her child playing in the road, like they did Suzanne's 4-year-old last week. The cops came. They couldn't do anything. It was the 6th case that month. The 26 who did the shooting was caught. He had no remorse in him. Said, to move up the ranks, you've got to make bare bones of the enemy. Kevin's dad didn't cry at his funeral, stood to one side, dark glasses on, and with shaking hands lit a Pall Mall red as his boy slid down the earth's throat. So I'm sad Lynthia wasn't with us, but that's a good example of her work. And if anyone is inclined to buy Afrikaans poetry, then I suggest they go out and buy 80 Cruz. It's a good collection. So now Marco and I are going to read a poem by another Italian poet, Valerio Magrelli, who is from Rome. Valerio was born in 1957. He lives in Rome. He's professor of French literature at the University of Cassino and regularly contributes to, I think it's 3 or 4 of the Italian daily newspapers. He has published, it's hard to keep up with Valerio sometimes, about 8 or 9 collections of poems. And all of his poems from 1980 to 2018 were collected in a collected poems called Les Cavies, which translated means the guinea pigs. Selections of his poems have been translated into major European languages, and Marco and I began translating his work back in the mid-90s. In the noughties, excuse me, we took a long break from translating his work while I wasn't writing for about 8 or 10 years. And then we picked it up again, finally putting together a selection of his poems in English from his first 6 collections. And that was published by Patricia's African Sun Press in 2015. And tonight, and this is the book there, beautifully designed by Patricia's son, and that's an image by my sister, a drawing by my sister on the cover, my sister Cleone. We're going to read an untitled poem from his second collection, Natura e Venature, which roughly translated means nature and veins. The poem is, I call the poem Qual è sinistra, è la sinistra. Over to you, Marco, for the...
Yes. Qual è la sinistra della parola? Qual è la sinistra della parola? Come si muove nello spazio, dove proietta la sua ombra, ma può una parola fare ombra? Come osservarne il retro o poggiarla di scorcio? Mi piacerebbe rendere in poesia l'equivalente della prospettiva pittorica, dare ad un verso la profondità del coniglio che scappa tra i campi e renderlo distante, mentre già si allontana da chi osserva, dirigendosi verso la cornice, sempre più piccolo, ma fermo tuttavia. La campagna lo osserva e si dispone intorno all'animale, al punto che la fugge.
The interesting thing about working together with Marco was that his knowledge of Italian poetry enabled me to discover Valerio's adaptive use of the language poetically. So transliteration gave you one image or one picture or one sense of a line or a couple of lines. But the adaptive use of the Italian meant that you actually had to look a little deeper, a little further. So I was afforded that. The other thing that I discovered, which is so important in the process of translating, is that as Marco and I worked together on the poems, I think both of us developed this strong and interesting sense of how Valerio's mind works. And that gives you a powerful interpretive tool for getting the translations correct. So this is Valeria's poem. Which is the left side of a word? How does it move in space? Where does it cast its shadow? Can a word have a shadow? Can it be seen from behind or placed so that it is foreshortened? I'd like to render in poetry the equivalent of pictorial perspective. Give to a line the depth of a rabbit running across fields. Make it grow distant as the distance between it and the observer grows. As it heads toward the frame, getting smaller and smaller, though it never moves. The countryside observes and arranges itself around the animal, the point of vanishing. So the last translation is a kind of homage on my part. Rolf Proske and I have known one another since '68, when we were at Rhodes University together. And they had a little bookshop just off campus called University Booksellers, where you could buy, I don't know, it was for about 50p or 50 cents or a nominal amount, you could buy copies of the Penguin Modern European Poets series, amongst which there was a Rilke, there was a Brodsky, there was all the Central European poets. So I've been friendly with Rolf for over 50 years. Rolf was born in Germany, but grew up in South Africa. And we're going to read a translation of a Rilke poem that I did, essentially on my own, but asking people for help here and there. And it's his famous Panther poem. I mean, it's probably one of the most famous poems, certainly one of the most famous German poem, I would say, in the non-German world. And it's been translated quite a few times. So as the story goes, Rilke was working as the French sculptor Rodin, working as Rodin's secretary. And Rilke said he was talking to Rodin and saying how his writing was blocked. So Rodin said, look, go down to the zoo, look at the animals, look at an animal until you're inside it, and then write about it. So off he went to the Jardin des Plantes. And he looked at various animals. He tells afterwards how he looked at various animals and he just couldn't get on with them. And then he arrived at the cage of the panther, where he struck gold. Rilke's poem is, I think, one of the finest short poems ever written. It's been much translated, so the question is, why on earth should I embark on it? Well, I always thought that the Leishman translation, which was in that original Penguin series, was the best that I'd come across. An eccentric translation, one has to say, but it carried some of the strangeness and of Rilke's mind. I wanted to see if I could get the German slightly more accurately into English, while sustaining Rilke's form in the poem, his rhyme scheme, which a lot of the translators simply abandoned. So I'm not sure one can ever fully translate a poem, but I'm actually reasonably happy with the result. So if Rolf, if you're there, if you can unmute yourself and you can read the original Rilke.
Yes, sure. Can you hear me?
We can hear you.
All right. Right, let's let's give it a go. Rainer Maria Rilke, Der Panther, im Jardin des Plantes, Paris. Sein Blick ist vom Vorübergehen der Stäbe so müd geworden, dass nichts mehr hält. Ihm ist, als ob es 1000 Stäbe gäbe und hinter 1000 Stäben keine Welt. Der weiche Gang geschmeidig starker Schritte, der sich im allerkleinsten Kreise dreht, ist wie ein Tanz von Kraft um eine Mitte, in der betäubt ein großer Wille steht. Nur manchmal schiebt der Vorhang der Pupille sich lautlos auf. Dann geht ein Bild hinein, geht durch der Glieder angespannte Stille und hört im Herzen auf zu sein.
Thank you. The Panther. Because he's passed that many bars, his views so jaded there is no room for anything more. As if there are 1,000 bars and no way through, that 1,000 to where the world was before. The lithe, strong passage of padded paws going round and round in the smallest space is like power dancing around a central cause, where a giant will stands, stunned in one place. Only sometimes does the curtain hanging still before his pupils quietly lift. Then an image goes in, sinks through the limbs' tense silence until it lies in the heart, where it ends its being. Okay, so that's the end of the translations. Thank you, all of you have helped the translation section, Marco, Rolf. I'm just going to read a few poems now of my own work, sort of echoing some of those. And the first one I want to read is a poem called Diagnosis. And it's dedicated to, it uses an epigraph from John T. Driver. And the epigraph is actually a snippet of a letter or an email that John T. wrote. And in that email, he said, he posed the perennial existential dilemma. And he said in the email, he said, I keep wondering, what's the point? To which I gave a diagnosis. A pheasant came into the garden, seemed lost, uncertain what to do, about the dog behind the glass, insisting it was worth a bark, wanting at it, wishing to dishevel its gaudy Beau Brummel look, to deconstruct the meat of it. It took nothing more than a handle, rattled twice for the bird to get the message and swiftly scarper, smacking the air as hard as it could to gain enough lift over the hedge to the safety of next door's lawn, a much friendlier place, perhaps. Thwarted, the dog wandered slowly towards its bowl, glancing back as if to say, enough with all the dry stuff. I need choice cuts. Doing what dogs and children do, with wide and guilt-inducing eyes. How strange is our predicament, being ill at ease without a cure in sight. You walk into the sea or jump from a height, but what cares? The loops just keep on running. We think that thoughts the sine qua non, and far too easily do we forget unthinking existence is the main theme.
Hey, Douglas, sorry to disturb you, but Richard has just entered the room.
Right. Richard, where is it? Get him up, get him volumed up. And we'll quickly hear his Latin. Richard? No. He's having trouble still. I'll plow on. So following on from Marco's poem, Alla Luna, which is, it's a poem full of archetypes in my sense, particularly surrounding the moon, which is a perennial archetype in poetry. I'm going to read the poem Journey from the Middle Years. Where was the Middle Years? There was an early collection, the Middle Years. It also, so Journey, I think, relates somewhat to Catullus as well, but certainly relates to the journey of Odysseus. It has that same archetypal sense. The one thing I could mention in the poem is it mentions dolphins. In the classical time, the dolphin was seen as a messenger of the gods. Journey. The horizon goes on being there, every morning where the light begins, every night where the stars end, and always the face of water, every emotion, and occasionally smoke, or a school of dolphins. Beyond that, there is always land. The old ones say they can smell it, even when half a world away, never touched and never reached, its substance no more than folktale, legend. Then suddenly one day, it is here and now, a place that stares back at faces staring at it from the rail, a long glitter of beach and swarms of birds above forest to the shoreline, a mountain behind. But no landing, and no sign of people standing to observe the passage of a ship, and you are left to imagine them in their living, how they eat and couple, talk and sleep, watch for danger from the sea. The water continues passing, sibilant, every morning metal and blood, every night an endless, impenetrable ink. The old ones dream and sniff the air, and when dolphins pass, they lean out over the rail, listening. So following on Lef is a poem I have from Liminal. There we go. Called Bottles of Scent. And there are two words that I ought to just unpack quickly to help. Velleities are slight wishes or tendencies, merest inclination, and the word limb, which is to outline something, to delineate it. So, bottles of scent. Because the forgotten outweighs the remembered as an ocean, a pond, the fleeting, the shadowed, the velleities that limn and almost correspond to what was once him or haunting day long, ineffable, yet possible. You suddenly wake in the half-light of dawn to a rise and fall song that engenders recall of hands that you held, bottles of scent, a dress with blue flowers, the chair near the door, a cup of weak coffee, the voice that could call through window and wall, the voice that could solve the wounds and the gall. And then an odd little poem that popped out post-Catullus, really called Strange Daylight, and it's about the eruption of the unexpected, which we've all recently been through. how lives can be turned upside down, how worlds can change in a moment. And it relates, this poem I think relates also again back to diagnosis, that sense of the realities of life are much more, life is much more unstable and fragile and tricky and difficult than we like to acknowledge. The poem is called Strange Daylight, and it has an epigraph from Pliny the Younger. But the greater part were convinced that there were now no gods at all. The men in the fields are taking a break, leaning on their hoes while they gaze distractedly across late summer waves of grain towards the slopes where wisps of cloud keep curling up the mountain's flanks and around the peak. This is how it begins, how it always begins. The ground has shaken twice, before daybreak and now again, but they pay it no heed. They have become used to it. One felt a jolt and woke early, but it left little evidence except broken tiles and a cracked beam. The air seems heavy and the light unusual. One of them lifts a skin to quench his thirst, wiping his face with a cloth before spitting and cracking a coarse joke about drink and gods that sport with the hooved. They all laugh before returning to hoeing in silence. The weather has been uncertain for a week, with none of the full August heat that's now needed for their crops to ripen. They sing to the rhythm of their work. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. While they still have air to breathe, they sing 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. This is how it begins, how it always begins. And then following on Lynthia's poem about the death in gang warfare is the sad loss of my friend Chris Mann. And I read this previously at the Zoom remembrance of Chris, but I'd like to read it again. I think tragedy and loss is what levels us all. From the humblest to the highest, we become equal. So the poem is called In the Dark and Wide Landscapes of Time, in memoriam Chris Mann, 1948, 2021. Once word had come that told of breath and life stopped in their tracks, that you had slipped away to join Douglas, Don, and Guy and Sid. I felt bereft, not for myself, but rather for our country's song that now has one less voice to sing of aloes, stones, and prayers and myths, love's echoing depths and history. Bereft because in all the wide landscapes of time you were that most necessary phenomenon. The heavenly sound of rain that falls all day on bare, parched soil. This is a poem which in odd, strange ways, I think relates to everything that's gone before. And this is where I'll finish, or there's one little thing after this. Poem called The Present. I like to, in my titles from time to time, create double entendres, where the word can mean two things or three things, and the word the phrase "the present" means. Quite a number, as you'll see. And that's from the collection Heaven. The present. Can I open it now? The boy asks his mother, who holds his free hand in hers as they walk, away from their Hodges Street home and along the edge of the green to the birthday party. They stand at the door and wait to go in. Inside, they can hear all the boisterous boys. No, it's not one for you, she whispers to him through a smile that he will recall for as long as his memory goes on serving him well, for as long as he remembers every so often to stop what he's doing and ponder a while. Let the tool in his hand dangle unused, or the half-peeled vegetables wait in the sink, while he sits and thinks his way through the years, getting smaller and smaller, his trousers shorter, until he can see his mother still standing again in the dress with bright flowers, the cloud of perfume that reminds him of meadows. To stop and remember them back on the porch, back in the sunlight, and quietly waiting. In his hand is a present wrapped in blue paper. In the other, her hand that makes him feel safe. The hand that she waved as she went down the steps. The hand he will hold at the moment of death. They stand on the porch in the afternoon light. The present grows heavier and heavier in his hand. He knows that the door will open to darkness. Again and again, he doesn't want to go in. I thought I'd end with a little translation, and that's from this book called Approximations, which came out in the late 80s. And that was the book of translations from the Hebrew that I did together with Israel Ben Yosef, who at the time was an academic at the University of Cape Town. And we did a selection of Hebrew poets, some of them dead and some of them still alive. One of the little poems we did was, and I don't have the Hebrew, and I couldn't read the Hebrew. It's all lodged at Amazwi from back then. But I've always liked it because I think it is a little poem that speaks about love, but it also speaks about death. It also speaks about writing, about poetry itself. And it was written by Yehuda Amachai, who lived from 1924 to 2000, and is probably the best known of the Israeli poets in the non-Hebrew world. He's been widely translated. It's called The Cause of Love. The body is the cause of love. Then the fortress that protects it. Thereafter, it's love's prison. But when the body dies, love is free to go, and in great abundance, like a broken slot machine, out of which pours with a roar all the coins of all the generations of good fortune. That's it, folks.
Sorry, Jacques. Before we end off the night, I think because Richard made it, maybe we should still hear that translation that we did not hear.
The original is Richard up and running. Richard, yo.
Fantastic.
Where is he? There he is. He's still muted. Oh, there he is.
Yeah,
Yes.
there I am. I'm sorry, I'm terribly, I thought this was going by UK time after summertime ended. So that's why I came in so late. My humble apologies. Yeah, I've got my text here.
Can we hear it, please?
Yeah. Okay, so this is Catullus, poem 76, which for those of you who know his poetry is like a long version of his poem 8, where he reflects on his disastrous love affair. He doesn't mention with whom in this poem, but one assumes it's the woman that he calls Lesbia. Okay. Si qua recordanti benefacta priora voluptas est homini, cum se cogitat esse pium, nec sanctam violasse fidem, nec foedere nullo diu ad fallendos numen abus homines, multa parata manent in longa aetate Catulle, ex hoc ingrato gaudi amore tibi. Nam quaecum quamines bene quic quod dicere possunt aut facer haec a te dictaque factaque sunt. Omnia quingratae perierunt creditamenti. Quare iam te cur amplius ex crucies, quint animo firmas, ad instinct teque reducis, et dis invitis desinis esse miser. Difficile est longum subito deponer amorem, difficile est, ver hoc qualibit efficias. Una salus haec est, hoc est tibi pervincendum. Hoc facias, siv id non pote, sive pote. O di, si vestres miserere, aut si quibus umquam extremam iam ipsin morte tulistis opem, me miser aspicit ec si vitam puriter egi, eripet hanc pestem perniciemque mihi, quae mihi subrepens imos ut torpor in artus expulit ex omni pectore laetitias. Non illud quaero contramut diligat illa, aut quod non potis est esse pudica velit. Ipse valer optet taetrunc deponere morbum. O di, reditem hoc pro pietate mea. There we go.
Thank you very much. It was great you made it.
Yeah. Skin of my teeth.
Thank you so much, Richard. Douglas, can everybody unmute and we can give them all a round of applause?
Before I hand over to Nondo, I just want to say, Douglas, thank you very much for those poems, and they've managed to be about life and about poetry at the same time. It's as if you've gone and given the story of the Tower of Babel a happy ending, you know, and we've really felt that we were part of a worldwide conversation tonight. Thank you very much to Douglas and also to Marco and Winnie and Rolf and Richard and all the readers. And now I'll hand over to Nondoe. Thank you. Thank you very much.